the sort of new introduction that Web3 might allow is that those resources could be directly paid to the forest itself that's doing it, maintained by the stewards and the communities that are the forest too. And that is really exciting, that we can have uniquely addressable endpoints where value can flow now that are stewarded by people, but are legally representative of the more than human world.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Welcome. Today's conversation is with Austin Wade Smith. Austin is the executive director of Regen Foundation. This was a really profound discussion in my view. Austin has this incredible ability to almost weave poetry when talking about our financial and legal and governance systems. And we really focused in on this idea of bringing economic legibility to our natural world. And this is highly related to concepts around rights of nature. I think this is one of the most profound ideas in the Web3 meets climate environmental space. So really excited to bring you this discussion. We also go through some of the philosophies of Regen Foundation, governance, bioregionalism, animism, going beyond carbon, and much more. This was recorded at ETH Denver in March 2023. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Austin Wade Smith. Today we're here with Austin Wade Smith. They are the executive director of Regen Foundation. Welcome, Austin.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. I'm very excited for this conversation.
Yeah,
first, let's start with what is Regen Foundation?
The Regen Foundation is the nonprofit arm of the larger Regen network. And we have a responsibility and a mandate to ensure that the future of climate finance is community-owned and governed.
Beautiful. And how does that differ from Regen Network?
Well, the Regen Network is a kind of thorny entity. The Regen Network is composed of the Regen Foundation, Regen Network Development, a software and registry ledger for-profit entity, as well as any number of project developers, regenerative land stewards, and participants in any aspect of that stack. So the Regen Network is a large community. More specifically, the Regen Network, that's the work that's done at R&D, is a project of making a decentralized native climate finance registry. So rather than being supported and defined by historically traditional climate finance institutional actors, their work is overwhelmingly opaque, it's expensive, and it's highly gate-kept. What the Regen Network has done is open-sourced the sort of protocol of creating a climate finance registry. And in the process of doing that, socializing and exposing the conversation around what standards we use to define regeneration.
And for someone that's new to this refi space, I think, or Web3 more broadly, it's somewhat fair to say that Regen Network and the Regen Foundation are really the OGs of this field. Been working on it for many years, and I want to unpack so many different layers, but I will just say at the start, the importance and the emphasis that you all place on the ethics and the integrity really comes through. And I think that is such deep medicine for our world and for our space.
Cool. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. Everything is on the line. When you look at measures of larger audits and rating systems around how people would define the value of regeneration, which is kind of what we're overwhelmingly talking about here. The measure that came out, a recent report came out in 2022 that said that roughly 3% of climate finance projects related to carbon can really verifiably prove that they've actually regenerated the biosphere. And so we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry where 3% of it can actually verify that it's helping. I oftentimes tell people, I'm not convinced this will work. I think it's one of the best ideas I've heard in a long time. And I'm committed to developing public literacy around the ethics and the technology at play so that the world can decide if they want to build on it, evolve it, fork it, dismantle it. But we need to socialize what's at stake around the environment and like financial systems. And the Regen network has always put at the forefront regeneration. And I do think we are pioneers in the regenerative economic space, particularly within Web3. And part of what has been the core concept and intention around the Regen network is to describe regeneration in a much more holistic space than what carbon does. We understand that carbon is, it's like not a problem, but there's an overabundance in the atmosphere and it needs to be sequestered because the defining element of our economy and our globalization is about burning fossil fuels, right? In pursuit of regeneration, the Regen network has foregrounded that we have to construct a much more holistic set of parameters that we should describe regeneration through. And so you can consider it an evolution of carbon and getting past carbon tunnel vision to talk about how the biosphere and planetary regeneration is an interdependent process. Carbon is an actor in the story. It's important. We need to sequester carbon, but it's not the only one. And so we've really tried to foreground that conversation and build systems and standards to discuss that in a more rigorous way.
Love it. And how did you come to this particular expression of the work? And what's your journey been to Regen Foundation?
Sure. I am a sworn environmentalist and have been my entire life. I am deeply motivated by the presence and the power of the living world, and I felt like I've been entangled in the living world my whole life. I prefer to call it the living world over nature because I think nature presents a dualism that is precisely what I am against. I've had a couple of acts. This is my most recent one. I'm also an artist and a designer. I taught design at some universities in the Northeast for many years, and actively am passionate about plants and gardening. I am a person that has been bitten by the orchid bug. I got that from my father. It is the most masochistic love there ever could be. And I, in high school, my job throughout all of high school was working at a greenhouse, and I ran the tropical section of a greenhouse in Kansas City where I grew up when I was 16. And I spent a long time really interested and excited about the intersection of technology and the environment, and thinking that they are fundamentally related to one another. And so for many years, I taught classes specifically around environmental control systems and their applications to gardening. You can call that CEA, Controlled Environment Agriculture, another way of saying greenhouses, another way of saying hydroponics. And it's a way of thinking around feedback loops that are both biotic and technological at the same time. I really like working with young people. I really feel excited by intelligent young people who take their ideas seriously. It brings a lot of joy to me. And although that part of teaching was very exciting for me, I felt like I wasn't doing enough. I felt like we were, in a way that the design disciplines that I was a part of were picking out the color of the wallpaper when the house was on fire. And I increasingly became convinced that the house is on fire, because it is. And so I thought, like, I need to have more of an impact. I consider myself a technically proficient person, fairly literate in that space. And so I thought, like, how can I more actively integrate sort of technological and data end of things towards the pursuit and the exploration of the climate crisis? And so I was really interested in environmental data and environmental information and environmental counting. You know, you have to define these loops within growing systems through information. And at a certain point, I started thinking that counting could also be understood as accounting. Where's the difference between those two? And that was a reflection of, what do we value? And so I could say that data measures or is a reflection of the living world in some way, and those are numbers, that's counting. And how does that transition into accounting, what we value? And I am really excited by some of the paradoxes in that question. And so I moonlighted in regenerative economics. I was like, we need to think through on an economic level what's playing out here. And in so doing, I discovered the Regen network. And I thought, these folks seem pretty legit. They're sincerely permaculturalists that thought that some of these technical systems could be beneficial to that process. And so we picked them up and started developing on them. But it didn't come from finance or tech first. It came from a community of people who were deeply oriented towards regeneration and permaculture. And I saw that. And I was like, wow, that's pretty exciting. So I hung around and basically read every bit of literature I could find and did a deep dive on what macroeconomics was, because my background is originally I was also in sciences. My college degree is in ecology, plant ecophysiology specifically. I studied endomycorrhizae relationships in Ponderosa pine on the Front Range of Colorado, where we are right now. So I didn't have a strong understanding of economics, but I decided I needed to understand that better. Right. And over time, it worked out that I started organizing in a smaller team at the foundation, and now today in 2023, I'm the executive director.
Wonderful. And we're just recently started to get to know one another, but being in your presence evokes for me that it really hits home when you say things like the house is on fire, or everything's at stake. Like, my experience of you is that you feel this. It's not just about the accounting. And I'm also just curious, as a meta question, like, why, and maybe you interpret it differently, but for me, it does seem like there's different levels of sensitivity to the deterioration of our living world that is currently around us. And we're all experiencing it in different ways. And just curious your reflections on how we enter into that sensitivity and that feeling state and that recognition, and then how it informs the work and what that journey's been like for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. It certainly points at one of the absolute core tensions around regenerative economics, because it gets into very intimate territory. I actively identify as, an expression of the planet. As an individual, I think people are that. I think technology is too. And so when we talk about these systems and these ideas, we're looking at them at a level of asking who we are. I think that one of the things that makes people who we are is the process of building technologies and technical systems, or inventing things that we think are novel and new, only to find out that that was what was happening the whole time. And that we have to build new things in order to see the grace and complexity of the living world that was already there. And I think that's part what makes us human. So I think this is a very human effort, what we're doing. And it definitely also means that I take the work home with me, and I think about it when I go for hikes, which I love to do. I love backpacking in particular. And yeah, I think it's an interesting way to ask a sort of core set of questions from many different directions. But I don't want to say it's like a spiritual journey per se. But I think that what's at stake is nothing short of everything. And I am excited by, it's going to be problematic if I say I'm excited by the climate crisis. I'm not, but I'm excited by the fact that it requires one of the greatest coordinations of a mutual alignment of people we've ever had to do. And that in the process, we will rediscover what we are as people in doing so. And I love that.
So let's talk about the approach and how you're thinking about it, and the vision, the stack, and take me through Austin's brain and some of the visions of how this can look.
Sure. Let's see. I'm gonna start answering that with something that we were discussing a little bit before this interview that has to do with the color of my shirt and this camera. That we're being filmed on, because we're being filmed, and I understand that. And
wait, we're on camera?
Really? What? Yeah. So cameras can see some colors better than other colors, because the structure of the lens and the composition of the chips and all of the technology that's in the camera can see certain colors better than others. And there's a lot of politics embedded in that too. We could talk about like what complexions cameras are tuned to see, because who should be photographed or not, right? And so we embed into the systems that see and record and coordinate the world our beliefs, our biases, whether conscious or not. And so some cameras are better at seeing other colors, and I learned just before this interview that this color green works well on camera. And so I'm interested in that question. I think that's actually got it all there. I think that what colors the camera sees is a really elegant way to describe a larger question around legibility. And a lot of my work centers around the question of legibility. And I'll say that another way to say that all of my whole project, in a way, has been in part around the question of animism. And I would love to talk about that. But what we often attribute as agency to things, or actors, that we assume is like historically, like it's a matter of their will, like their ability to do things, is oftentimes, more often than not, a reflection of what our systems can and cannot see. How is the living world legible to the systems and technologies that we've built? In just the same way as what colors are legible to the cameras that aren't here. Right. So that question around legibility and agency are fundamentally linked.
Right. And so the economic system has certain types of legibility today that is obviously leaving out tremendous amount of our living world.
Right.
And what we're talking about is nothing less than the transformation of information systems to make more things legible in greater degrees of accuracy.
Really well put. Accuracy, or just at all, seen at all. Like there's a lot embedded in the phrase internalities and externalities, and you could say that a lot of what like regenerative economics is about internalizing negative externalities. Like, we don't have to put into our expenses, our budget, we don't have to be burdened with the negative externalities of the pollution that we're releasing. And so we could say that in incorporating externalities into the balance sheet, we make those lives, those niches, those stories legible to the economic systems that we're a part of. There's a double bind there that we can certainly explore. But I think that question of legibility plays out in a lot of ways, not only around value. So one of my other entry points into this entire world was around what's a kind of ugly name, the rights of nature movement. And it's not a very elegant phrase to me, because rights is inherently an anthropocentric construct, and nature is inherently also an anthropocentric construct in its dual nature to culture, right? And we've never actually separated those two things. So I entered into this conversation and into this space very much activated by the question of the legal personhood and the rights of the more than human world. And so I think that is also a question of legibility, because the camera sees colors, the courts and the legal systems see persons. And the brilliance of what the Voices of Nature or the Rights of Nature movement has done is that it has found a way to make the more than human world legible to the legal system through personhood. And courts see people, and there's established laws around injury or the right to prosperity, the right to be at all, to exist. So personhood is the medium through which courts can make the planet legible. And it's a powerful, powerful moment there. What I'm really excited about is taking that premise and multiplying it across as many domains as we can find. I am passionate around environmental advocacy. I believe that we have this gift of seeing the beauty and the elegance of the living world, and with that we have this responsibility to speak on its behalf. We are the voice of nature, humans. And simultaneously to that, we can extend advocacy with this larger question of legibility. And that is, in a way, making our infrastructure exert pressure on itself to transform, because we've made it now have to see what was once blind. And I'm interested in legal versions of that, economic versions of that, political versions of that, and informatic data versions of that together.
So that was very well spoken and exciting to imagine into. And so what I'm hearing is that this legal movement around rights of nature, and we can both agree that rights of nature as a term is fairly crude and doesn't quite do it, because rights being very anthropocentric and nature being dualistic and kind of creating this separation between humans and nature, which is obviously not the case. And, as a tidbit, in New Zealand, we're often told that they don't, Maori people don't like the term rights of nature, and that it's much more about kaitiaki, stewardship or guardianship, and taking responsibility for our place in the natural world. But so this rights of nature movement, which is growing, and from my perspective, and the conversations, it seems like this is very ripe, and that there's going to be a lot more enshrining in the legal system the legibility of the natural world, whether it's at constitutional levels, like what happened in Ecuador and Bolivia, and was one of the first major, cornerstones of this, or what's happened in New Zealand, where the Te Urewera Forest or Wanganui River or Mount Taranaki, like literal mountains, rivers, and forests being declared to have the rights of personhood. And of course, we've given corporations rights of personhood.
It's crazy. If a corporation can have personhood, why can't a blue whale? Right. Seems like our most base instinct is to understand that there is a life and the right to live there. And we've actually, how incredibly philosophically complex is the idea that we've given personhood to corporations. Like the work was already done.
Right.
It's exciting that like you can pick that up and then use it in this whole other way.
Right. And so what you're pointing to is now we have that transition happening with legal legibility, but that there's also around economic data informatic legibility. And so how does Regen Foundation, the work in Web3, like intersect with this vision?
Yeah. One of the challenges around defining the state of a non-human as a person is that that's maybe not actually that difficult to do. The legal system and the frameworks in place make that relatively easy. Where the rubber meets the road is actually enforcing that, right? So we can say these trees have standing, but then somebody's got to go to bat to uphold that. And that's work and labor. And who's paying for that? So the circling back to this question of like a higher dimensional understanding of regeneration would be to say that the legal frameworks from the rights of nature movement can be expanded upon to be more enforceable or enforce themselves. And I think we have to talk about what we value there. Again, the question of counting to accounting happening. And so the rights of nature movement is profound, and it has enfranchised, as my colleague Grant Wilson would say, the more than human world in the legal system. But the question of enforcing that is a burden of resources and time. People have to do that. So one of the core programs at the Regen Foundation is developing a kind of protocol that weds the legal standing with economic value. Because I think actually at the end of the day, these are things we all already know. We know that the river has a right to flow. And maybe that's kind of an odd phrasing, but we know that it should be respected and it has the right to exist. And we also know that it has value, that it brings value. Like we understand that the water cycle brings value in as much as we understand that maintaining a healthy system for rain to replenish our crops brings fundamental value to our economy. There's a statement, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but some number of billions of dollars is contributed to the US economy every year by bees in their pollinating work.
Right.
And if they all go extinct, which they are, that will have to be paid for by people using technologies or whatever kind of exploitative system that might come up with to replace that. So it's interesting that people have a hard time, I myself included, have a hard time talking about the value of the living world, but I think we should get more comfortable with that discomfort.
And to date, a lot of that dialogue seems to have come through the terminology ecosystem services. Right. And can you reflect on what that means to you or how you perceive that term?
Sure. Yeah. Ecosystem services as a term is precisely the contributions that bees make to the agricultural movement in the United States, for example. Services is another way of saying ecosystem functions that are legible to the economy. So there's all sorts of functions and processes that are playing out in the living world, innumerable numbers of them. And some class of them we find helpful, like pollination, because if bees don't do it, something's going to have to do it. So ecosystem services is a kind of core tenet of trying to make the living world legible to an economic framework. And it invites all sorts of interesting tensions and frictions. But it's been the dominant form through which it happens. And in replacement of ecosystem services, maybe we can look back at the broader category as my colleague Ned Horning at Regen Network would say, that we should talk about ecosystem functions. And we should, they have value. And we should put our money where our mouth is and say that they have value. So that's sort of like the beginning of thinking around an economic framework starts in ecosystem services. And, if we decide, we will measure what's valuable to us. So if we decide that carbon sequestration is what's valuable, then the only ecosystem service we see is carbon sequestration. And we understand that soil carbon cycles and different biomes sequester it in different ways. And so it's a much more nuanced landscape. But that notion of service, I think, is interesting too, because it actually has to do maybe with a question around labor. And another way of talking about making the more than human world legible to the economy is talking about work, like respiration or metabolic rates that are happening that sustain us. So I think it's a kind of complex assumption to we have to cast the world in our own image in order to see it. And in the process, we can then learn anew all the things that are beyond us. And so maybe we could talk about labor. We could talk about the labor that trees do. And if these phrases are uncomfortable, let's double click on it.
Okay, great. So essentially, what we spoke to is that partly informed by the inspiration from the Rights of Nature legal movement, what you're sensing here is an opportunity with Regen Foundation, blockchain technologies, to bring legibility to many more of the actors of the natural world.
Right.
And that legibility can translate to economic and data and other ways of relationship value flows. And that this really is a conversation about what do we value.
Right.
And so can you help me now get a bit more concrete for folks to understand, how does this practically manifest in ways of human coordination or in terms of the tokens and the blockchain and the systems and so forth?
Yeah. Well, let's be clear that the notion of payment for ecosystem services, which is maybe a phrase we haven't said yet, or just to be clear, that's payment for ecosystem services, is a sort of, in effect, a class of economic approaches to incorporate negative externalities that were not included on the balance sheet originally. So that project did not begin with Web3 or DAOs or the blockchain. The premise around valuing the living world as a sort of asset class, which we can discuss, has a long history. I will give a concrete example, but I hope it doesn't actually confuse. But we've pegged our wealth and our power to the living world as assets for a long time. I mean, the entire premise of holding land as a source of power, or gold or minerals or rupees, that we have these gems that are of value that we've assigned, and that's where a source of power comes from. So this premise around assets or ecosystem services is not new. We've been doing it forever, in a way. And what becomes more interesting for me in particular is around measures to make that whole process more transparent, so that we can be having this conversation with a lot more detail and resolution. So the Regen Network, in describing it as a registry, is a space where a proof of regeneration is demonstrated, whether that's actually in the outcome or the proof that a set of practices have been implemented, which we know are verifiably helpful to regenerate the biosphere, that those practices or those outcomes are measured in a kind of durable way. And from that, we can say there is some value that's been created in the world, whether that's through pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere because 1,000 trees were planted, for example. So 1,000 trees were planted here. We understand according to this ecological cycling in this biome that CO2 has been pulled out of the atmosphere. And so the registry is a way of taking that proof, whether it's in practice or an outcome, and saying there's a system of value here. And the working term is a credit. That's a carbon credit. A lot of other kinds of carbon credits might be sleights of hand on balancing sheets. And it's really hard to determine if something is actually helpful or not.
Right.
So carbon credits are a way of saying carbon has been pulled out of the atmosphere. And that can happen in a million ways, and that can be verified in a million ways, and there be dragons there. What the Regen network is attempting to do is to build generalizable frameworks and standards around integrity of that, not just for carbon, but for many other kinds of ecosystem functions, like pollinator health, like aquifer restoration, like the cleaning of pollution in rivers, like the mitigation of erosion, like keystone species reintroduction, like habitat corridors, these things that we understand through ecological science and from just being of the planet are necessary for the biosphere to continue. And so we want to say that regeneration has value, that people who volunteer to want to support that work because it's work should pay for that. And we need to have robust, transparent ways for that to be demonstrated. And so that, what I just described, is a tentative way of calling an eco-credit. An eco-credit is an extension of a carbon credit into a much more holistic space around regeneration. And that is the kind of core crux of what ecological economics is trying to do. I might not say REFI is trying to do that, because REFI is trying to do many different things. But here we're coupling the legal personhood movement of the rights of nature with credits originating around proof of ecosystem functions and merging those two together. We're saying those can be compatible, symbiotic, and resonate in a powerful way. People aren't doing that yet.
Right.
And
Right.
that's what I think the foundation and the Regen network, that is a very exciting entry point, that those two systems can resonate with each other.
Absolutely. And so, let's say 5 years from now, I can go spend a day at a river, pull out bags and bags of plastic bottles and pollution, and file that as a proof of regeneration. And in this network and system, that river, its ecosystem services, its function as it's legible to this network and to this economy, has real value exchange happening. And so my contribution into that space also is valued. And importantly, what you're suggesting is not only are you trying to go beyond carbon credits into a broader class of ecological credits, eco-credits, but that you're also recognizing the right to life of the river.
Yeah.
And that the river can also have legibility in this system and participate, not just it be only about the human economy. Do I have some of that correct?
No, absolutely. And you raised a really interesting point, that we might overemphasize like ecosystem functions as the core to regeneration, because there's a lot of dirty work done by human beings, human persons, to do this that is considered not valuable. In an analogous way that in the 20th century, that a patriarchal economic system did not see domestic work or care work as valid productive work, it was not included as considered legitimate. But that's work, and we understand that that care is incredibly important and it must be valued. And And in just the same way, people who clean up watersheds or who plant trees, that's work. That should be, in an economic phrasing, pretty cut and dry. We're not trying to say the tree is doing labor here. We should even start more humbly than that to say people who are doing the work to regenerate the biosphere, that labor has value and it should be compensated for it. Because it's ultimately always going to be a story of the community which stewards and is a guardian of that ecosystem. A forest is the people that live in it too. It's not just the trees and everything that's not people. So your point is, I think, really important because it's always an entangled story around the work that human beings do and the more than human world does. And we don't have a framework that I know of, and I'm still getting my bearings on this, that allows us to discuss like the co-working around sustaining all of this world between humans and the more than human world.
Right. Right. So because you're not suggesting, we're not suggesting that just because the forest is recognized in its truth of living beingness, that the community embedded within that forest can't cut down trees to build a house. Right? This isn't to suggest that there's not a very real relationship between life and death, between humans and more than human world, whether that's the food we eat, the materials that we use in our economy and in our livelihood spaces, or transport systems that we create, and so on and so forth. But that these things have legibility and consequence baked into that legibility so that we can better attune our relationship with the natural world and understand, well, if my action is destroying bee colonies, that has a very real effect, and that needs to be recognized in our forms of value that we see,
Right.
Rather than it just disappearing externally off the balance sheet, so to speak.
And I absolutely agree with that. And I don't think we should make it solely the question of moral appeal
Right.
to make bees stay in existence.
Right.
I'm not against advocacy. I'm all for, and I actually think this economic approach can help accelerate the broader transformation of consciousness that happens within people so that they personally change. I don't think that it's a way of outsourcing reconciling the challenge. I think it's a way of putting pressure on ourselves fundamentally to change. Like we're building constraints into the technologies and the infrastructure that we make for this kind of behavioral change to happen. Because as long as it stays a story of moral appeal, like do the right thing, all of our systems are oriented and designed around profit. So you have a David and Goliath story of like moral advocacy versus all of our infrastructure and technologies being predicated on extraction.
Right.
And, one of the interesting things about Web3 that's relevant here that I'll prompt, and I think we can explore how this might play out, is that what it allows us to do is to give a unique address in the world to the more than human world. That we can build points, endpoints in this big web that aren't solely brokered by people anymore. Now, they might be stewarded like guardians of forests and rivers, but the unique addressability on blockchains allows us to start talking about how that river or how that forest could actually get paid for the work that it does. And so we can say payment for ecosystem services or ecosystem functions is powerful, and it's an important tool towards this sort of legibility transformation, but the sort of new introduction that Web3 might allow is that those resources can be directly paid to the forest itself that's doing it, maintained by the stewards and the communities that are the forests too. And that is really exciting, that we can have uniquely addressable endpoints where value can flow now that are stewarded by people, but are legally representative of the more than human world.
So just to underline that point, because I think this is one of the most exciting contributions that Web3 can bring to where we currently are at in this rights of nature conversation. So the river that I live near can have its own economic point, its own wallet in the current lexicon, where it can actually receive value through tokens and be embedded in the smart contract layer of this cryptographic blockchain economy, so that the river can, if a portion of payments that are being made in and around the river's functions, whether it's access to water or whether it's ecotourism to go kayaking or whatnot, a portion of the economic value can now, for the first time, actually legibly be distributed to the river itself.
Directly.
And now, okay, well, the river has money. What does that mean, Austin? Where does that take us?
Yeah, I really like your formulation there. If the river has an endpoint in the web that is uniquely its own, we know that that the river is not going to in just the same way that a forest is also the people that steward it, a river is also the community of people who are sustained by it. I love this truth that what we might think is like this, we're giving legibility to the more than human world, is in simultaneously a celebration of the fact that we are also part of rivers. Like, what is the edge of what a river is? Oh, it's a watershed. Okay, it's part of the hydrological cycle. I mean, can you talk about a more impossible to bound or define entity than a river? It absolutely implicates people in it too. And I love that truth. So talking about having addresses for rivers in one way allows us to cut through a lot of crap and say, okay, this entity, this network really has value, and we should think of this as a new kind of primitive, a new kind of basic hold of value that then we can start to discuss how is that governed? How is that stewarded and administrated? There's a lot of learning to be done by the builders of technical systems to just listen and show up and learn about how people have been stewarding rivers in the first place. And that premise should translate into how the value that river holds should be administered and managed. So if a river has an address or an endpoint, it's ultimately the project of human beings who can support and sustain that entity to sort of govern and decide how that resources are distributed. You could also say that in real-time environmental data around that river informs how that treasury is dispersed, which is pretty cool.
Wow, right.
And in that way, I think we're taking some of these ideas around trust or personhood, which is frameworks around value and personhood that are from the economic and legal systems, and we're doing them a lot better. Or have the potential to streamline that into a very transparent, clearly outlined framework. And in my mind, all of this is, in a way, an elegant rearticulation of what the commons has always meant. And so that we understand a river to be a commons. And so is the data about its well-being and its health. And with the unique addressability, within blockchains to give an endpoint to that river or that watershed. We can talk about how that river holds value. We could also talk about how that river owns its own data, because the wallet is really just like a store of information and value. So we can talk now about not just the river having a treasury, so to speak, that then is governed and dispersed by a commons of stewards. We can talk about that river owning its own data too. And we're beginning to construct higher order ecosystems of identity. And Web3 is not designed initially to do this, but it opens up in a much more transparent way how this might play out. And it wasn't possible when it was proof of work. It was just a non-starter because it was so environmentally cataclysmic. Proof of stake is, I think, 7 orders of magnitude less. It's nominal. And that will keep going down. I believe that consensus algorithms there will be a renaissance of them, and we'll find new ways to find consensus within these decentralized networks. And so when that happened, that it wasn't prohibitively expensive to do it, because it was basically not collateralized on burning fossil fuels to verify the network, that has opened up the environmental movements, orientations, and questions around how blockchains can be helpful.
Right. And I want to get to that more broadly, but staying on the topic of a river, and I've heard Disco refer to it as a data backpack. And so, what we have now, let's bring some actual tangible examples of what this could mean. And obviously, who knows? But what you're saying is, so the river, maybe there's a pollution level or acidity level that is measured, and that could automatically, or with the governance of the surrounding community and stakeholders, trigger some sort of release of funds from the treasury in order to work on cleanup or work on some intervention. And now we have new ways for people who may have only been able to access this on a volunteer basis to actually be remunerated for their contributions to the river. Or the relationship between farms and discharge and intake of water could actually now intervene with, or intersect with the rules of these systems and protocols to have value exchange with the river. And maybe it's not just dollars as we traditionally think of it, but these are new token representations, new forms of value exchange in these kind of ecological services. What else comes to mind, and how might this reflect itself in kind of practical human activity?
Yeah, great question. Ultimately, it needs to become something that can support and sustain human communities, right? It needs to be a fiat currency that is recognized as legitimate. And we can talk about how a big part of that project is to allow there to be better exchange between like a digital currency and a state-backed currency. And that's a really exciting and interesting question. One of the upshots here is that we're starting from zero. And that 0.0001 is enormously bigger than zero. So if there's zero incentive for people to be remunerated for the work that they do, and we can make even the slightest dent, it's a step up from zero, where there's nothing. So if a river had a treasury that was, say, that it earned through the issuance of, like, say, eco credits, that people had proven that they had like worked to steward and sustain that watershed, and it was verified in a transparent way, and on a voluntary ecosystem service market, someone purchased that credit and retired it, then that river would say have a source of value in its treasury. And then you could say, if there is a verification by a shared held set of standards, that anyone who helps chip in to continue cleaning and maintaining that watershed, there's a contract that will automatically pay them for it. And so now we have at all a system to compensate the work of regeneration where there has only been punishment for bad acting. And so another way of saying what I do at work is I tell people I build tools to do the opposite of punishing people for polluting. We build tools to compensate people for healing. And if this is a thorny topic, like, let's talk about it. This is the conversation we need to have. People don't seem to have an issue for others being fined and punished for bad acting. And of course, they should be fined and punished for bad acting. But can we not look at that from like positing something, like a positive side, that people should be compensated for the good work that they do? And maybe the incentive space that we're talking about can appeal to the good nature of people and not punishing the bad actions there.
Why do you think we struggle so much as a culture of what this gravitation towards the negative punishment of actions and not the positive encouragement side of things?
Well, oftentimes bad things happen at a time scale we can see. Like oil spill's pretty legible, right? We can see that. We can see when a train goes off the rails and makes a huge pollution spill somewhere in the Midwest. That's breaking news. That's like on your timeline, on your feed. So failure is a punctuating kind of thing. And we're good at seeing punctuating things, like we're good at seeing a large tiger running at us. It works on a timeline that's visible to us. And I think the good stuff is oftentimes the slow accumulation of sincere effort over time that makes a negative positive, makes it like a net positive impact. And so we have a hard time seeing that kind of stuff. So you could say there's like a negativity bias that we have, that we're hardwired to see the problems in order for us to really avoid it. But in an era, particularly around social media and things like that, that's really backfired in a way. But I think we're like pretty hardwired to see failure and not particularly well wired to see slow, gentle accumulation of positive outcomes.
Got it. So you've touched on it a bit, but I'd love to go deeper into this small little question of governance, because who is responsible and who gets to speak for the river, and how will these governance patterns take shape, and what can we try to do now at this outset of a lot of these tools to ensure that this evolves and matures in a healthy direction?
Yeah. I talked about listening before, and I think that's really probably what the Regen Foundation does the most, is listening to the existing models and practices by regenerators around how they do what they do. And so the question around governance is a really good question, particularly when value gets involved. People, myself included, will commonly say, like, in a way, governance is sort of like the last resort, because what we should really do is like have dinner and find consensus, and in the process get to know each other better. That's a good way of doing things. When we want to talk about like clear administration of value and resources, I think we should codify that in along clear terms. This is pretty well formulated in commons theory. The challenges of coordination around common pool resources. And we could talk about common pool resources as the well-being of the fish in the sea or in a river, or we can talk about that resources being like the actual like value in the wallet of the ecosystem, or we could talk about that common pool resource as the data that it generates. And so a lot of the talk around Web3 and DAOs in particular, I think, is trying to codify in a kind of durable form the practices that have been going on for millennia about how people mutually sustain commons towards the mutual benefit of themselves and the resources and the ecosystem, because it's going to go on for a long time in perpetuity. So governance is a big question, and we have a tremendous amount of learning to do around how people administer and coordinate the well-being of the living world in a sustained manner. The legacy of imperialism and colonialism and the enclosure movement, which has taken the commons and enclosed it, captured it, and rendered it with value, has fundamentally evacuated so many stories and life histories around how people have done this. And we have to relearn and listen to those. And that's what governance, that's where to start, in this kind of fundamental way that there needs to be a learning and listening that happens around how people have coordinated and sustained themselves and the living world together. Because we've basically only understood the value of something, or a hot take, we've only understood the value of something that's been enclosed. And what we're talking about is finding the value of something that isn't enclosed. It's still itself, it's its own, but it has value. So we can talk about, is this a commodity or a commodification, or is that a spectrum? But I think one of the things we're fundamentally doing is prying our understanding of value away from enclosure and capture as property. And we're saying you can't just only, you have the right to you can buy land, cut down the trees and sell them for timber and earn value from that. But we're wrestling fundamentally this notion of value about how it can be understood as a kind of commons. And if there's one thing in my read that the blockchain and DAOs in particular can do, is scale and make durable and easily distributable models for how people manage common pool resources. That's like one of its best contributions, scaling the commons. Because it's a coordination challenge. And to date, there hasn't really been a way to do that. So it's either a state or a market actor to do that. And I'm not opposed to either. Of course, the state would be involved fundamentally in this conversation, and that's an interesting thing to talk about. But the commons itself as this idea and this paradigm that I think has kind of defined what we are as people for the long arc of our history has been this. And relatively recently, like the origin of private property, enclosure, and capture that comes with colonialism and imperialism has like erased those histories. And the story of governance, in my thinking, around the living world is about relearning those processes by which we stewarded, and then trying to actually embed them into technical frameworks that we might call a DAO.
So I'll just summarize some of the threads I'm hearing you say about Regen's approach.
Let's go.
Effectively beyond carbon into eco credits.
Yeah.
And the intersection of rights of nature into new forms of legibility, be it economic data, that enables a whole new possibility set. And that there's this approach, especially when you start to unpack governance, of really first listening and asking the question, what came before? And before the colonial imperialistic enclosure, movement, that we're recognizing that there were other ways of being in relationship with the natural world. So we're also listening to that to try to inform what's now a very human act of building tools to try to codify new forms of resolution and precision into our human coordination activities and layers to get back into right relationship with our natural world.
Yeah, totally. I think putting that another way is that um, that we're finding a way to value to we're finding a way to 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 codify what we've always known, that nature and the biosphere of the living world is valuable, and and that we're of it. So loving it is a form of self-care. And from the perspective of like a financial system, in terms of financial legibility, we could talk about that in terms of like we're at this like in a renaissance moment of trying to do better within our financial system of seeing the living world and its value. And credits are one way of talking about that. Real world assets are another way of talking about that, or natural assets are another way of talking about that. And that in order to get closer towards what is the ultimate aligned and shared purpose, which is like not all going extinct and having all of the biosphere go extinct as well, that we have to redefine and explore what the terms of like a truly regenerative asset would be. Mm. And that is exciting. And in that process, what if this like works? If we're starting from zero and we're wanting to make the like most modest dent in changing this, let alone systemic change, if value flows in a new way, because we've understood the integrity of ecosystem functions and ecosystem services, and value flows in that direction towards regeneration, how does that not ultimately become divisive to the communities who are practicing regeneration? And that goes back to this classic conversation around commons and governance. Another higher level idea here is that we're having to create a new unit of labor and of work that's human and more than human together. And we've just gotten to the point where we understand to pay people for their labor, but in our interdependent, symbiotic, inextricably linked relationship that we know we have with the world, we have to start developing new units of accounting that include people and more than people in them. And the blockchain can do some really powerful things there with giving addresses and addressability to the more than human world, and also to help codify and determine how it's stewarded and maintained and governed. And those two together, I think, point us back to an original part of what we are, is that we're stewards of the living world, and now we're redefining economic systems to properly reflect that. And I think it's possible. I think it's possible to do this. We're in an era of a really important reflection on the integrity of the currencies and the claims that we make around the assets that we claim to have, around what are those really composed of? How can we verify that? Who's ultimately benefiting from that? And having that be something which is publicly verified and transparent. And the Web3 space, I think, can be really powerful in doing that.
Right. Yeah, because I think here we are in 2023, carbon credits are a thing, possibly going to grow a lot more and regulated in different jurisdictions in different ways.
Yeah.
Now there's a lot of talk about biodiversity credits.
Right.
And so far, my listening to the conversation is still sensing it in a very top-down, uniform, trying to find the end-all, be-all super measurement that takes all of the world's information and pumps it into one atomic unit in order to recognize that we have to go beyond carbon. And so well-intentioned, I hope, but still counter to my experience of the natural world, which is that all of these conversations are local, first and foremost. And, having moved from the United States to New Zealand and having the felt experience of a completely different ecology where the inputs and the outputs and the human activity and the culture and everything else is it's fundamentally different and needs to be different to be in integrity. That trying to come up with some global biodiversity metric is potentially very problematic.
Yeah.
And so how do you think about that and the level of resolution in terms of eco credits vis-a-vis what's nice to have when we have global liquidity pools that can actually create uniform stores of value and so forth to bring resources in, but at the same time needing these governance models, these measurements, these activities to be locally informed?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the successes around carbon is that it's a very discrete unit of measure, which is easy to track, and with a little bit of introduction, anybody can really understand. But it is kind of remarkable that we have found the most sureness in the unit of carbon as like a metric ton of a gas that no one can see. It's pretty abstract. You're pointing at a really important problem or opportunity that I think is very urgent right now. And I was in Montreal for the UN Biodiversity Summit, and this was pretty much the conversation happening there. And the conversation that's happening there being what units of measure or standards should there be to think around regeneration beyond just a metric ton of sequestered carbon. Now we're in a much more thorny, wild world of interdependent relationships that are not transferable. This is not a fungible system with which you could say a bison in one continent versus another is in any way comparable, or any other animal in an ecosystem, or a regenerative practice in a different ecosystem. I mean, even to the point around carbon sequestration and its drawdown, it happens differently in different biomes and different bioregions. So we need to have communities of regenerators being the originators of the standards of what they believe regeneration is. And in making a decentralized sort of open source protocol, the intent is that regenerative communities themselves set those standards and do the regenerative work, and that this is a protocol or a process to make that legible. But it's not the Regen network nor myself originating, but making really clear kind of rails in a process of conditions that communities can manifest themselves. So the biodiversity question, if we can go back to that, is a really important one, in part because it's so unmeasurable and it will break the assumption in the first place that maybe outcome-based approaches are what we should be measuring. Should we be measuring outcomes, or should we be measuring practices? Or another way of saying it is, are there sort of other indices that we can look at if we want to do measurement, which inevitably we'll do, that are illustrative of the larger state of things? So an example would be, how about a credit that isn't explicitly around tagging, identifying, measuring the prevalence of sea turtles, but rather, how about a credit of 1 metric ton of plastic removed from the ocean, which we can really measure that. It's pretty verifiable, and we understand that down the ecosystem chain, the benefits of that. So we don't have to set ourselves out on this data problem, although people love data and they love throwing a lot of computational muscle at a data problem, which is a major risk in refi right now. But we can understand that certain practices have positive impact. Another version of that in the biodiversity that I'm particularly interested in is around keystone species. That we understand that keystone species are vital towards the life and the well-being of many other organisms. And ecological science, as well as like traditional ecological knowledge, can demonstrate that many times over. So rather than trying to measure and account for all the different kinds of grass or the different herbivores, if we discuss the incidence, the quantity, and the well-being of a keystone species population, we can by extrapolation understand the benefits that are happening there. And in order to make that measure, we have to like really learn about the ecosystem to actually show up. And that's to your kind of point of how these emerge in a bioregional context in the first place. That there will not be a one-size-fits-all measure for talking about regeneration, period. It is a social project. And so when I said the foundation is around communities owning and governing this process, we mean that. And the biodiversity credit makes that, I think, really apparent.
100%, because we're starting from a pretty low amount of ecological literacy.
Yeah.
And so part of the project is to bring that learning in dynamic relationship with the natural world. And so when we introduce these systems of value legibility, it does encourage us in many ways to learn more, to engage more. And I think that's one of the beautiful aspects of this. It also seems to me that there needs to be, and I'm curious, maybe you're bringing learnings from the work with greenhouses into this, but the feedback loops and adjustments that need to be made so that we don't just latch on to one credit as the end-all be-all form of value, because ecosystems are changing, and it may be that we discover a new practice that has a disproportionately positive impact on regeneration. And so we need to be able to bring that into the system. Or it may be that an extreme weather event fundamentally alters the conditions.
Right.
In New Zealand, invasive species is kind of the top priority of conservation. And the downstream effects, if the conservation movement in New Zealand is successful at removing a lot of these invasive species, means that we're dealing with a different ecology, and that there's going to be different regenerative interventions and activities in that world than there are today. So sequence over time, it has to be somehow embedded into the feedback loops of the system.
Yeah.
And so does all of that happen predominantly in the governance models, or are there other ways that you're thinking about feedback loops?
Great. I would say we have to find a balance between what we understand to be like a kind of prototypical framework for a credit to be made. Like we understand there's obviously it has to meet certain standards and be verified that it's actually helping and not hurting, which is a big thing to put out in front. We have to balance the sort of like making a kind of framework that people can build on, while also recognizing that almost every claim, claim around ecological state is going to be unique. And we don't want to reinvent the wheel every time a new project seeks to develop eco credits. And we also don't want to have a top-down approach, which is incredibly problematic for so many reasons. So
and can I interrupt you there just to intervene a bit of? So I've known about Regen Network for a long time and been watching for a long time, but part of my existential question of the entire approach in space was witnessing carbon credits in New Zealand have a lot of perverse incentives and consequences.
Yeah, for sure.
It is, we steward as part of Mangaroa Farms a large block of pine trees, and we're in the practice right now of how do we return that back into native forest. And the economic incentive to plant what is essentially an invasive species, genetically cultivated pine, fast-growing, short-lived, optimized for commodity exports,
Yeah.
tree, in kind of a monocrop model, incentives overwhelmingly favor that from a carbon credit perspective versus native forests that can live for hundreds and thousands of years, that have complete other properties of ecological health around biodiversity and soil carbon and ecosystem function. And we know that as a country, the conversation is broadly in consensus that we would rather have this type of ecology than that type of ecology. And yet, because of the institutionalization of carbon credits,
Yep.
We can't like work our way out of a wet paper bag.
Yep.
And so, I've just been really saddened by witnessing that and wondering to myself, if that's happening with the introduction of carbon credits, do I really believe that introducing more types of credits is going to get at a better world? Or is this, and that's been the issue I've been grappling with. So now I want to return back to that thought and if you can kind of bring some of that, the unintended consequences, and how do we adjust from them along the way?
Totally. Any measure which becomes a metric ceases to be a good measure, as they say. So if you measure carbon and your metric for regeneration is carbon, you're going to get outcomes which maximize that measure, right? And that can be another form of just disfiguring the face of the planet. So if the incentive is around one dimension, like carbon sequestration, then maybe although it is beneficial that carbon is being sequestered, we understand it as only one band in a much larger spectrum that we're discussing. And the carbon market has struggled with this, and this has been a fundamental flaw of carbon markets. While there is potential for carbon sequestration and drawdown to occur, it's the only parameter that's being sought out in what's otherwise a much more high-resolution, holistic space. So I think one of the key opportunities that we're talking about here is the design of higher dimensional credits. And by that, I'm kind of talking about eco credits. And by that, I'm talking about a kind of checks and balances system that's embedded into the issuance of a credit that not only measures how much carbon has been sequestered, but might also cross-reference this to start with the incidence of a native bird that nests in one kind of tree and not the other one. And talk about how much is the aquifer or the water table being replenished to. And we put these elements of the living world in motion together. And there is an interesting question, an opportunity in Web3 around what could be called oracle design, which is like the trustability of the information that you have or the claim of ecological state that you have. And we should support and celebrate the renaissance of eco-credit designs that should be developed. Let a million methodologies bloom that put in motion many different ecological parameters together to give a more holistic portrait.
Yes.
And the purchasers of credits who say this is valuable and this matters to us can do so because they themselves see the integrity, or they themselves have a personal relationship with the parameters of ecological well-being that are being defined in that credit. And that it's ultimately people conversing with other people and having an identity with a history of a place. And we can revisit this in the broader context or in a more specific one if you like, but I think there's something around fungibility and non-fungibility right there. Because now we're talking about something that's from somewhere. It's not from somewhere else. It has a story, it has a history, it has an identity, it has a notion of place in it. And one of the traumas that is playing out within climate finance is in some way this question around the fungibility or the non-fungibility of credits, because they can get indexed or bundled together in order to become more fungible, which is an interesting thing to talk about. But at its core, they're stories of a place, and they can't circulate like currencies. Maybe we shouldn't. We understand that their currencies are a signal of value, and by people purchasing them, they say this matters because they have a belief that it matters. But we might not have to enter into such large spaces around like fintech stuff, around like liquidity and like large asset pools and things like that, because in a way they're actually really become a kind of like story, and that there's a closer coupling with the person who purchases it and the origination of that credit. And so it's not an offset, but like an inset. It's absorbing the origination as part of this, that the purchaser and the originator are in a dialogue together. And biodiversity credits, biome-specific, context-specifics, is what you're describing, begin to really reveal the edges of this.
And how do you think about that idea where maybe we're able to create more of a closed loop local economy where the buyers and regenerators are in tighter proximity and relationship than just thinking about, master pools of carbon credit revenue from corporations offsetting then to translate into landowners having the ability to earn regenerative income. But what I want to bring in is this thread of the global north and the global south, or the countries who have had, a real head start on economic development and contributed far more to now the ecological consequences of that. And what is our beautiful vision of a system moving forward that also reconciles these base level inequalities and challenges in terms of the economic reconciliation?
Yeah, well, there's certainly a clear binary between global north and global south, if I can use those phrases, bound up in the notion of an offset. That the offset is like two sides that you're giving back. That's a kind of reparations for harm done from dispossession and extraction. So the notion of an offset, I think, is fundamentally an othering in its idea, and I mentioned the word insetting before because it begins to think about how we're in this together while recognizing that the developed nations of the world are overwhelmingly responsible for the degradation of the biosphere. I would advocate towards thinking about value and how the notion of credit and ecological regeneration is issued from a bioregional perspective. And I think that we should encourage and support the growth of economic systems where purchasers and origination are happening in the same bioregion. And a term that I use sometimes is like a value shed, that there's not just a watershed, but there's a value shed. Or in another way, that those at the mouth of the river are responsible for supporting the source of the river too. And it's all one shed of value and of water. And so if we can trace the contours around regeneration and consumption and good acting and bad acting, around what's upstream and what's downstream, metaphorically and literally, I think we start to talk about some pretty radical new economic thinking. And I'm really energized by that, while simultaneously saying that like loss and damages, which is like that the wealthy nations are responsible for paying up for catastrophic environmental disasters that have occurred in the global south or in poorer nations, that we can leverage sort of proof of regeneration or like proof of environmental catastrophe as a way to like bring accountability and responsibility in the spirit of like loss and damages. So it's both a bioregional affair of where the mouth sustains the source as per insetting It's a kind of value shed, and talking like using these systems around regeneration to like very clearly demonstrate where and how bad the harm is happening, so that through loss and damages and other mechanisms where wealthy nations are forced to compensate. So it's kind of like two different aspects
Right.
that are a global and bioregional scale working together. And I think we have to do both.
Yeah, the issues are multiscalar.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I want to end maybe with some commentary about animism.
Sure.
And I know it's very dear to your heart.
Yeah.
So can you share a bit about what it means to you, how this informs your work and journey?
Thanks for asking about that. Yeah, I think that the notion of that animism is not a sort of magical dust that's put onto objects to bring them to life like a Disney movie, although it's cool that Disney movies are so good at like animating the more than human world. Like we're taught from a little kid to do that. Kids are pretty tuned into that. I think that animism and technology are fundamentally interlinked with each other. And actually what we should be pressing our technology to do is animate the living world and making it bigger, not just easier or smoother or more frictionless, that we make it more awesome, like full of awe and exciting. And one of the kind of phrases that I think about is that like every shadow is a sundial if you like learn how to read it, but you have to show up. And animism is a process about showing up in reciprocity to all the other patterns and processes that are happening in the living world. And in that way, participating in them. And I want to live in a technical paradigm where we realize that our artifice, our invention was in a way all a means to animate how the agency and the beauty and the complexity that's already around us. And that they're not separate, that machines or technical systems and the living world, like we build these things in order to better understand how we're all that much more enmeshed and ensconced in things. And animism is a kind of invitation to do that. And I think that's one of the things that defines us as a people is our ability to see these beautiful relationships play out and like feel inspired by the beauty of the world in a way that like other animals might not be able to do. And with that sight comes a responsibility to like take care of it and to understand it even more and more. And I want our technical systems and even our legal and our economic systems to like animate the world for us. And there's a wager here, is that did we have, in order to understand the complexity and the beauty of the world, did we have to invent a system that extracted from it so fundamentally that it's compromised? Like there's like this fundamental paradox there. I don't think we had to destroy the world in order to understand its beauty at all. I think that's actually a limited number of elite people that are making an enormous amount of resources off of that. But there's this question about in bringing all of these entities, the living world and all of the organisms and stories that populate the world into like a legible focus, have we created just an all the more refined system to capture them? Is now everything like a security? Everything can be an asset. And there's this question might be like a false paradox, but I think the question around like how our technology animates the world invites that paradox to be discussed. And if nothing else, like it's incredibly important that for right now, we're talking about that. And that people understand the terms and the assumptions and the technologies and the ethics that are going into this larger economic movement. So yeah, I'm an artist. I think that technical systems are an incredible way technology is an incredible way for us to celebrate just how big and beautiful the world is that we're a part of. And I want that story told like a few more times beyond just the military provenance or the origin of like technology as a form of like domination and weaponization. That dualism is false. And I think that that's fundamentally the work that we do at Regen Network, is in pursuit of this.
Well, I'm so grateful, Austin, to your presence in this conversation, in this space, for bringing these conversations to light, for inviting us all into these different ways of thinking about it and feeling it. And I'm looking forward to many more conversations with you in the future. Thanks for so generously sharing your time and your thoughts with us. Is there anything else you wanted to say to end or close off?
No, I think you've made a really lovely space to give room where room is necessary to be talking about these things. And there is an overwhelming, I think there's an overwhelming tendency for people to tease out the sort of like bad nature in one another. And I think that what we're oriented towards, certainly at the Foundation and Regen Network, but just more broadly, is to help build better systems to support the like intrinsic reciprocity that people have. And I want to appeal to the positive, symbiotic, mutualistic part of what makes us a social species. And you setting up the space to actually go into some of these conversations with more care is super important in that process. So thanks for making it happen.
Great. Thank you.
Whew, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Check out Regen Foundation at regen.foundation for more. And, you know, there's a big gap still between some of the ideas and theories that Austin and I were discussing versus what's built and what's available for prime time in Web3. But all the raw ingredients are there. And so it's just an exciting moment to be in the space. And it's really an opportunity for all of us. If you enjoyed these topics, I would invite you to check out the conversation we had with Gregory Landway from Regen Network, as well as Sam Bennett, who is a product manager of the Regen Registry. And also, we had a conversation with Aaron Matariki Carr from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And Aaron has firsthand experience of rights of nature in the context of Te Urewera rainforest. So really fascinating discussion that can complement this one. You can find links to all of these conversations and more on the website, maearth.com, as well as a link to our community Discord. If you are enlivened by these ideas and these discussions, especially around rights of nature meets Web3, would love to talk with you. You'll find me there in the Discord space. I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for tuning in.